everyone, it's Katie from Chords Records. Welcome back to my channel. I visited the Velvet Fog record shop in what's called a record bar in Katoomba, Blue Mountains, New South Wales, Australia. It's very near where I live, and it is an absolute institution of record stores run by a guy called Paul. It's been around forever, maybe 20, 25 years. Moved into various locations, but I know the guys really well, and shout out to them. I picked up some amazing Australia and New Zealand classics just recently, and I wanted to go through them. This is going to be quite a short video, maybe 4 or 5, but I've been really getting into two different types of, I'm calling them Antipodean sounds, two different types of kind of that Aussie, New Zealand rock at the moment. And I'm kind of deep diving into really learning and understanding about it. The first is early Australian, kind of late 60s, early 70s rock music. So whether it's psych into prog. And I have kind of missed, that's been it's a blind spot in my knowledge. I've been far more focused on overseas, and I can't believe that I haven't really been getting into the Australian stuff. And it's obviously really popular in places like America, and it's being bought up a lot. But I'm slowly deep diving, and it is just amazing. And then the second is sort of New Zealand 70s and 80s kind of punk, post-punk, that grunge, sort of Dunedin sound, if you like, Flying Nun era. I grew up in New Zealand all through the 80s. That was my wheelhouse. And I used to go to a lot of gigs at a place called the Glue Pot in Auckland, and did a lot of, I've got thousands of negatives of photographs of this era. But kind of sold all my that sort of teenage, sort of uni student records, back, and now I regret it all. And my sister was a much bigger fan of this era, and now I'm rediscovering it. And of course, they're so expensive to get now. So just to take you through the 4 or 5 albums I picked up yesterday in my never-ending kind of journey to acquire these albums. The first is an album by Jeff St. John's, Copperwine. Now, for those that are familiar will know, like if you know, you know. I recently showed on my channel a compilation from the same era from around about that time, and on the Affinity label, and it featured a couple of Jeff St. John and Copperwine tracks on it, and I just instantly went wow. And this was at Velvet Fog, and I picked it up. It's not the best copy in the world. This is an original 1971. The cover's in pretty good nick, actually. But the vinyl has, it even has on here plenty of marks, some crackle, but plays fine. And it does play fine. It's a bit crackly, kind of part of the ambience, I guess, but it's on the Spin label. As I said, it's the original. It's got a couple of kind of scratches on it which don't really come up, a few clicks and pops, but this album is such a treat. So Jeff St. John sort of famously was born with spina bifida and played his gigs in a wheelchair. But a real blues guy from the late 60s, early 70s. And he joined Copperwine for about 3 years. And this was his kind of the debut album, Jeff St. John's Copperwine, but not long after they split up due to differences in songwriting credits. But this album is phenomenal. And there's an amazing song on here called, which one is it? Any Orange Night, which is just this incredible bluesy instrumental, worth the price of admission, but very blues rock and absolutely as good as anything you'd hear from something like Traffic, for example. Absolutely brilliant. I cannot recommend these guys highly enough, and I can't wait to discover more from this era. The next one, I've done this in chronological order. The next one is another Australian one, and this is kind of interesting. It's known for a very famous song. So this is Max Merritt and the Meteors, an album called A Little Easier. And the famous track from here is the final track on side 2 called Slipping Away, which is a gorgeous song, which has got this fantastic drum break, and then it changes key, and it's almost yacht rock in its sound. But the rest of the album is exactly what Max Merritt was, which is this soul, funk, kind of bluesy guy, mainly soul and funk. And this was kind of mid to later career, actually, because he started out in New Zealand in the late 50s in Christchurch. And a really fascinating story is that the American base for Antarctica was in Christchurch. It was the only place big enough for a runway at the time to get to Antarctica. It was a military base. And so there was this American infiltration of rock and roll. So Bill Haley and Elvis Presley, and they were getting all these records, and in some cases instruments like, Fender guitars were arriving, very hard to get at the time in New Zealand. And this is where Max Merritt left school age 15 or 16 and started a band called the Meteors. And he had some kind of moderate success in New Zealand up until the mid-60s when he moved to Australia, and then had more success. This album didn't come out till like 1975. So we're talking almost 20 years later after he left school and started his kind of that soul funk rock and roll career. And this album is a real treat. It's got some fantastic tracks on it. Not super popular. I mean, if you go onto Discogs, only 14 people want this. It was probably, sort of a bit of a miss for a lot of people, but I absolutely love it. And I'm just adding to my kind of early Australian rock collection with this album. Right, now we get into some New Zealand amazing heavy hitters, and I cannot believe I picked these up. Right, so the first one is another, if you know, you know. It was one of the first albums on the Flying Nun label out of Dunedin called The Clean and Boodle Boodle. The Clean, of course, Chris Knox, and gosh, an absolute institution and pioneers of that Dunedin sound, kind of that coming out of it was late 70s, 78, 79. Flying Nun were established in 81, I think. This album came out in 1981, and it's the debut album of The Clean. And it's very post-punk grunge in its nature, but it really is its own sound, which is why it was called the Dunedin Sound. And Dunedin in New Zealand, if you don't know, is a famous university town. So you had a lot of students coming together, playing this incredible music. And Flying Nun obviously went on to be one of the greatest record labels for this sound over the next 20 years. And some of the greatest New Zealand bands came out of that era. This album came out. This was sort of an EP, actually. It's a 45 RPM in the first year of Flying Nun's label. And this is an original 1981. If you know this album, it came out in 2 versions. The first version came out with a comic, and the second version, same year, same kind of release, came out without a comic. And this is the version without a comic. Still highly sought after, in really superb condition. To show you the fantastic label. And the music is very raw. It's not what you would call, it's not sophisticated in its sounds. It is that kind of raw punk or kind of grunge-ish, not particularly mature musicians, but very invigorating music. And then related to that, at the same time, and they actually shared a lot of the musicians over this time in the late 70s, early 80s, was a band called The Chills, also signed to Flying Nun. And when I was growing up in New Zealand in the 80s, I was far more familiar with The Chills than I was The Clean. But they didn't release full version studio albums until about a decade after they'd been playing music. They released a lot of singles, but then they got signed to Warner Brothers kind of sub-imprint called Slash, and they released their first proper studio album, then their second formal studio album called Submarine Bells in 1981. So in 1990, so a decade after they'd been playing music, but they started at the same time as The Clean in the late 70s, early 80s, and had a lot of crossover in their members. And so their sound, the Chills sound, started off as a bit of that post-punk grunge sound, very similar to The Clean. But by the time they got to this album, they really had moved into that synth pop and very well executed and well produced musicianship. And it's such a great album. It's still got elements of the Chills, grunge. It's still got elements of the punk that they'd come from, but it was moving into far more melodic and far more lyrical style music, and almost that British Depeche Mode or Spandau Ballet synth pop or new wave even. And this album was huge in New Zealand. The first track on it, Heavenly Pop Hit, was #1 in New Zealand. And it wasn't on the Flying Nun label anymore. It was on Slash Records, the imprint from Warner Brothers in America. And this is a first press of that album. Really great album if you're sort of interested in checking kind of the Antipodean music out. That's a really good one to find. The next album is Weddings, Parties, Anything, one of my favourite bands from Australia from the sort of 80s and 90s. Kind of folk rock or alt country maybe. Their background was actually sort of came from the punk world, but it almost like the Pogues, if you can think of the Pogues. And there was a time in Melbourne during that sort of late 80s when Melbourne had a kind of an alt country scene going on, and this was one of the big bands to come out of it. Weddings, Parties, Anything won ARIA Awards, which is our Australian equivalent of Grammys, and lots of kind of pedal steel and banjos and sort of yeehaw type kind of party music, and they were fantastic. And what was really great about them was very Australian centric. There's this album particularly, The Roaring Days is actually from a great Australian poet called Henry Lawson, and they're very Australian. They tell folk stories about Australian everyday. They talk about Brunswick, which is a famous suburb in Melbourne. They talk about MCG, which is a famous sports ground in Melbourne. And so very Australian centric. I just love them. You put this on and you smile and you dance, and it's just such a great Australian album. And almost you can hear the Australian accents on it, which is just, it warms your heart when you're Australian to hear that. So that's Weddings, Parties, and Anything. And then finally, a real little treat. It's a single which has just come out. Does that look familiar? So what is it? It's a 7-inch single called Andy Says, obviously tribute to Andy Warhol's cover of the Velvet Underground. It's actually a sticker which you, rather than peel off, you can stick on and then do it. It peels, but I'm going to keep it obviously intact. And It comes in a really cute poly-lined inner sleeve, which I really like. The track itself, Andy says, and the B-side, Creeping Jane. And I'll just put that up so you can see who the musicians are. There are who's who of Australian 80s rock bands. So Sunny Boys, The Saints, the Celibate Rifles, just a bunch of different, the Drop Bears, that's right. So all these musicians have got together. They've been around for probably 10 or 15 years now. And I think they're about to release a full album. But they play live music in pubs, and they've released this fantastic 7-inch, and the song is great. I'll put a needle drop in here as long as I don't get copyright marks on me. So yeah, there you have it. The Hovering Spooks, brand new 7-inch single, very limited edition. No idea how many there are. You can see SPK01. It must be their first one they've released. So that's it. My little kind of look at Australian, New Zealand pickups from Velvet Fog. Thanks, Paul. Absolutely love you guys. And anyway, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.